listening to the podcast series of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In our 20-minute conversations, we discuss the latest academic research on the region. I am Albena Shkodrova, a historian and postdoctoral researcher at KU Leuven, also the coordinator of the forum, and today I am very happy to have in the studio Professor Oliver Reisner of the Ilia State University in Tbilisi. Good day, Professor Reisner.
Hello, welcome.
You are a professor in European and Caucasian studies and earned your PhD in East European history from Georg August University in Göttingen, correct? And you also coordinated a master program on Central Asia and Caucasus at Humboldt University in Berlin. And I noticed that some of your major research interests include nation building and the development of civil society in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Your research on national identity has also explored the role of national memory, particularly the controversial position of Stalin in the collective memory of Georgians. And I thought an intriguing element of your career was that along the academic work that you do, you also have been involved in human rights protection in Georgia. You managed the human rights program for World Vision Georgia.
Yes.
Well, let me start by asking, why Georgia? What sparked your interest as a young German academic, I assume some decades ago, in the history and affairs of this country in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was studying East European history and Slavic languages and literatures in Göttingen, this was Perestroika period, and we had a guest speaker who invited two students from Göttingen to Tbilisi. So I applied and I got this position, came for 3 months late in 1988, when there was a beginning of national movement in Georgia. Perestroika was not so successful. Then Gorbachev launched Glasnost, and this then opened up really space for society really to reconvene. I was from Western Germany in that period, and we did not talk much about nationalism. And then I decided to write my PhD on nation building, national movement in Georgia, writing a collective biography of the members of Society for the Spread of Literacy among Georgian population, based on the approach by Miroslav Hroch, a famous Czech historian who did this in a social history, prosopographical approach, and this is what I did with the members of this society. So looking how the national idea spread from the intelligentsia into other parts of the society, nobility, clergy, how it grew then in the beginning of the 20th century after the first revolution in the Russian Empire 1905, 1906. And how this developed. Then I got this position as a coordinator of the first postgraduate master program Central Asia Caucasus. You have to imagine that in Germany, Russocentric approaches were very dominant. This was the first one that was looking into peripheries of Tsarist Empire, Soviet Union, and so on, and into their own right. And I was the first German historian who learned Georgian, and really tried also to include research from the region, so to overcome this Russocentric, Russian sources-based approach. After this project, I got an offer from World Vision in Germany to become a project manager of this human rights project on civic integration of ethnic minorities in Georgia. And this coincided with the Rose Revolution. So I followed, became a witness to these developments. First national movement in the late 80s, end of the Soviet Union. Then the Rose Revolution when Saakashvili came to power and they tried to overcome a lot of Soviet legacy, but then turned out to be more and more authoritarian. And there I really set up 4 youth centers to bring youth of different ethnic background together. And for me as a historian, this was an eye-opener, because I started to work in the regions and realized really the different perspectives that people have from the regions. National histories very often are very centristic in a way, to the capital or to the main actors that are then focusing in urban centers. And Tbilisi was such an urban center, but there was also nation building going on, not only of the Georgians, but also of the Eastern Armenians, and to some degree also of the Azeri population, because this was the urban hub there where the media developed, so in national languages and so on. After 2 years working in the region, then I got an offer from the European Union delegation to Georgia to start working in their operations section, because the project was funded by the European Union Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. So I started working for EU. Something for me that I never imagined. And I did this for 10 years, managing cooperation in the field of research, of Bologna, so higher education reforms, cultural heritage agency twinnings, and so on. So learned a lot about how EU is working. And therefore then, when I had to leave, I preferred to stay in my beloved Georgia instead of going to another place elsewhere. So I left the European Commission job and became a professor at Ilia State University, who offered me and asked me also to cover European studies, because of my experience working in the EU structures.
Right. It is not a typical academic career.
No,
However,
no.
is Georgia open to more non-standard approach to academics?
In Georgia, you do not need to have a habilitation like we have in Germany.
Yes,
I do not
Germany
know how
is
it is
more
in Belgium.
rigid in that regard.
Yeah, so I had a PhD with my book that was published. It was possible. They also wanted me to teach also international students. So Ilia University is very much internationalizing. There are initiatives. We also had a workshop on decolonizing Eastern Europe, so this very West European-centric perspectives, and really trying to overcome this to some degree. And this is then also when I was invited to write country reports for the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, and really observing how it developed with a deep knowledge of a historian that really looks to it in a longer range. So I also published an article about the specificity of the development of civil society in Georgia.
I actually wanted to ask you about that. So what in your eyes is specific, and how did the communist period influence the civil society in Georgia, and what happened afterwards? What is specific for Georgia?
Because there was already in the beginning of the 20th century quite some social movements and so on that were mainly attached to the Menshevik, so leftist groupings that really became a people's party in Georgia in the late Tsarist Empire. But this all was destroyed after the Soviet occupation of Georgia in 1921, after a short period of independence in 1918, 1921. In 1924, there was a last attempt to return to power. This was unsuccessful, and then really Soviet power developed itself in Georgia. And of course, Stalin came to power. His nationality policy is the most important legacy that we have, because he wrote an article in Pravda, the party organ, in 1913 about socialist in content and national in form. And then Georgia, Armenia, Central Asian republics and so on were folklorized, so a focus on the cultural issues of the so-called nationalities. And the political, the civic, we would say today, was with the Soviet people, so the whole of the Soviet Union. The Georgians were very proud that a Georgian was the leader of a superpower after World War II and so on. But when he died, then also the link between Soviet power and Georgia somehow broke down. But only then in the end of the 1980s, when I came, then this cultural national form of nationhood came to the fore, where the national form replaced the socialist content. But over the last 20 years, more and more also with EU support and United States support, really there was civil society developing. There was also an understanding of civicness. that developed. And of course, the ruling Georgian Dream Party understood that this is a challenge to their power, that they can be voted out. Two different concepts and models that are also developing in a foreign policy orientation, more towards the West, European Union integration, coming closer to NATO and so on, or returning under the influence of the Russian Federation. Because with the war in Ukraine, the geopolitical order is to be renegotiated.
Right.
And the Caucasus has a very important strategic position here, because all other gas pipelines, so the so-called middle corridor, go through the Caucasus. And if Georgia will turn towards Russia, the democratic movement in Armenia will be in a limbo, and so then the influence of Russia will get stronger in this region again.
Going back to the question of Soviet influence on Georgian development and Stalin in particular, I was very curious about your research on this controversial memory or position of Stalin in contemporary recollections of Georgians. And coming from former communist country myself, I very well know how nostalgia works and how time softens the features even of the harshest dictators and regimes. But Georgia is a specific case because Stalin was a brutal dictator, and at the same time he was Georgian, and he made, as you mentioned, Georgia for a moment
a great man of a little nation.
Precisely. Gave it a bit of a star quality within the Soviet Union, right? So how do contemporary Georgians deal with that? What is the controversy that you discover there?
One important point is that there was never a real critical assessment of this past. Only in 2010 there was the Soviet Past Research Laboratory established that is also now under pressure by the government, that really tried to collect voices from people about the impact of a totalitarian rulership in Georgia. What the Georgians did very much is really externalize the past, so ascribing it to Russia as an occupier. Georgians, Zergo Orjonikidze, Lavrenti Beria, that were part of this repressive regime, and others were denunciating their fellows because they wanted to live in a better flat. Even this very pro-Western government under Saakashvili, they adopted in 2010 lustration law, but it was not about giving the victims of these repressions access to these KGB materials, who was really denunciating them, who was really responsible for it. It was just a symbolic politics, banning all Soviet symbols from the public and also fascist symbols, but that was it. And what we did together with the Georgian colleague, Elena Kekelia, she did some factual research in some villages. We analyzed how the Stalin cult, as a special instrument of rulership, was adapted in different periods. In Stalin's period, to glorify the leader of the Soviet Union as somebody who is integrating the diversity of people and cultures in the Soviet Union then, and also offering people that were hardly able to read education. Khrushchev then used this very Stalin cult and turned it 180 degrees around into the opposite direction, and saying it was all Stalin that is to blame for all the repressions, for the gulags and so on, not us, just putting the blame on Stalin. This was something that Georgians really did not like, and this was a disgrace what they did to the great leader and so on. This was when there was the first protest in Georgia against the Stalinization process that was launched in the secret speech by Khrushchev in 1956 in February. But also then in the late Soviet Union perestroika, there was an attempt to critically assess this past, but also then there were strong Stalinists that were trying to stick to that. And in the post-Soviet period, also this Stalin cult still was something that was focusing on. So the Georgians used this really also to externalize. It's all Russia to blame. Moscow was the center of that, was really occupying us and so on. But you can see that it was already democratizing and it was challenged by NGOs and so on.
It is interesting to know that this chapter is yet to be open in Georgia, but that discussion hasn't been taking place in all these decades since the end of the Soviet Union.
Now, it takes some time, and of course, Georgia is a small country and where they know each other, and the transformation from a Soviet republic to an independent state was really not very successful. There was a winter war and so on. The newly elected president, after 6 months, he was really had to flee. But what I am realizing now is that we very often try to apply Western concepts like civil society, democracy, and so on, and then we come always with incompleteness. But we cannot really explain what is really going on. This Western-centeredness also in our academic research is something that needs to be revised. So there are some works by Henry Hale about patronal politics in regime dynamics in the post-Soviet space, that these are factors that you can, for me as a hero, what I can realize and where I can understand better what happened in the Soviet period, but also now. Because these are patronal politics, and under the surface of ideologies and so on, there are undercurrents that are much more decisive that are going on in the informal sphere. Which is Elena Ledeneva, so did a huge research about informality studies. Yes. And I think this is what we need really to come closer to the specificity of the developments in different areas of the world, and really very carefully not to impose in a normative way concepts that were developed in American democracy or Western European democracy, because they can only highlight a kind of insufficient transformation towards a liberal democratic state or something like that. And this is in question now worldwide.
You said that you worked in various regions of Georgia. So I was wondering, what is your observation on the rural-urban divide during the communist period and now what is happening with it? Because it is an issue in most East European countries. So I was wondering, could you elaborate on Georgia?
In European Union, we have these cohesion funds that really try that the differences, living standards and so on, between urban and rural areas are not so huge. But in Georgia, still, it is very decisive shift. According to people's censuses, only 2 or 3 places, and these are urban areas, Tbilisi, Batumi, Kutaisi, that are growing, where there are jobs and so on. But the countryside is more and more depopulating. There are more than 230 villages that are empty. The living standards are closer to the poverty line than in urban areas. That's why many people try to find work in Tbilisi or in Batumi. The regions are more supportive to the power holders, while in the urban centers it's more than opposition-minded, because there is more possibilities also for the development of this civicness.
All right, and could you perhaps in conclusion say a few words about the reason you are here in Leuven and what kind of research you are starting on now?
Yeah, we are part of a consortium that is led by Leuven University, KU Leuven, on EU heritage policies in the Eastern Partnership, mainly focusing on Ukraine. Of course, with the war, a lot of heritage sites have been damaged because of this national cultural dimension, what is also framed as international identity conflicts that are very strong in this area, in the post-Soviet area, and very instrumentalized. And Russia denying Ukraine its independent development and saying they are part of our history, and so how can they dare? And Georgia is coming in here as a case for comparison. So we are contributing really how heritage is dealt with in Georgia, also with strong minorities, because also in Georgia the focus on the dominant ethnic groups, the Georgians, is very strong. So more than 80% of heritage sites so documented are churches, Orthodox churches. Yeah, so and very little really on minorities, on mosques and so on. They're very beautiful, but because they do not fit in this master narrative, is something that their situation and their position is quite deplorable sometimes. So this is then where we will develop. We are now looking in this conference where we are now to identify some common frame. We meet for the first time in person. This is very important, and really try then to continue this, how we will make the best of that our results and really fitting together, contributing to how also the European Union can improve its heritage policy in the Eastern neighborhood under the conditions of renegotiation of a global world order.
Thank you very much for this conversation. These are all very important topics, and I wish you success further with your research
Thank
on
you
the
very
heritage
much,
in
and,
Ukraine. Thank you
good.
so much. Thank you.
Welcome.